Hello and welcome to Vanta's Subject Matter Expertise, or SME, series, where we connect with experts on various compliance and security topics. My name is Eric, head of sales here at Vanta. Today, we're going to be chatting with cybersecurity and data privacy expert Matt Cooper to demystify risk assessments. All right, well, let's dive right in. Matt, let's take us all the way to the top. In the simplest terms you can provide, like what is a risk assessment and why might a company need one?
Sure. Okay, so a risk assessment is a formal analysis of essentially what could go wrong or how you would be missing opportunities related to information security. Um, it can get complex, but it doesn't need to be. And so I think hopefully we can, demystify it for folks a bit here and help to keep it simple. So there's a number of reasons why you'd want to do a risk assessment. The first one is you have to. So I say that because a lot of our customers, as you know, are pursuing some sort of a compliance attestation or certification like SOC 2 or ISO. And it's an absolute hard requirement in order to get a SOC 2 attestation, ISO certification. And if you look at, really any information security or data privacy standard, risk assessment is a key component. It's also something that you will be asked by your vendors on a questionnaire. Hey, do you do risk assessment? You want to be able to answer that truthfully, and so you want to actually do that exercise.
Interesting. The word formal feels scary, and um, I suspect many folks that are navigating or preparing for an audit for the first time are like, where do I start? And so, you know, I'm just like, Vanta aside, where we have a kind of, really kind of thoughtful risk assessment and risk register template. How should companies think about kind of approaching an exercise like this?
Totally. It's a great point. And the reason I say formal is because the reality is we're actually doing risk assessment all the time informally, but we don't necessarily think of it like that. So when a company is thinking about its information security posture and hey, like what things should we be doing? Hey, we should probably implement, multi-factor authentication, or I think we should really, get a pen test, or maybe we should start doing background checks on folks or do security training, whatever the control might be. We're thinking about why should we do that because we don't want something bad to happen, but we're not documenting that and writing it down. So the formal risk assessment is simply a method for writing it down, communicating it, which serves a few different functions. One, it's just a tool for communication within your organization. We can talk about kind of how that plays out for different kinds of companies, and it's also going to be something to show your auditor to say, yeah, we did a risk assessment. Here's the document. We wrote it down, and so you can see our thinking. You can see the types of questions we were asking. So in terms of how to get started, there's let's start high level. Think about your company and what you do and what you're trying to achieve. And so what are the business processes that are most important? Typically, those are related to how you make money, right? Like these are the things you want to do. If you're a SaaS company, you want to deliver your SaaS, right? And then you can think about within that, okay, to do this thing we're trying to do, what is the technology that supports that? And what are the processes and the people that support that? And then kind of what could go wrong? What would stop us from doing what we're trying to do? That's the way I'd start thinking about the risk assessment.
Yeah, interesting. Can you fail a risk assessment?
Sure. So the number one way you'd fail your risk assessment is you didn't do it. Okay. So you're going to your SOC 2 and your CPA is like, hey, where's your risk assessment? And you're like, I forgot to do it. Yeah, you failed. More often than not, you will have done it. And then there's there are ways you could fail it, quote unquote, or have issues. It kind of depends on the context that you're in and what are the more prescriptive requirements of the standard or framework you're trying to achieve. So a couple easy examples. If you are, processing PHI or health information, but you don't consider risks to PHI in your risk assessment, oh, you're going to have an issue with that, right? In SOC 2, for example, there's this very prescriptive requirement around considering fraud. So if you didn't consider fraud in your risk assessment, you could have some issue with it. ISO is probably the best example because is one of the more prescriptive standards with respect to how you need to do the risk assessment. So let's say you didn't get risk owner approval, didn't consider residual risk, didn't consider impact and likelihood, something like that. Now, when I say you fail it, I'm being a little bit tongue in cheek because more likely than not, you have done a risk assessment, but there will be some issue with it that you need to correct. It's not necessarily a hard fail. It's rather the auditor comes back and says, hey, you kind of missed this section. And so in the case of ISO, you'd get like a minor nonconformity. Hey, you did the risk assessment, but it didn't quite meet all the criteria. And then you'll get an opportunity to go back and correct that for your
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that myself. So when I think about the risk assessment exercise today, right, it's kind of recapping what you said. You're kind of going through and kind of evaluating risk across kind of the various parts of your business. You're documenting that risk. You're assigning some kind of risk profile to it, some likelihood. And then my understanding is you're actually then like creating a task on the back end of that and assigning that out to someone to go actually go address. And so talk to us about kind of like timeline, well, the kind of the task creation side of this and the timelines associated with that. So, just kind of putting my kind of first time doing this hat on, it's like, what if I identify a risk that I assign to someone to go remediate, but the timeline for remediating that goes kind of past the date when my audit is scheduled? Like, am I in trouble there? Like, how's the auditor receiving that?
Yeah. Okay. Awesome question. So when we think about, let's just keep like SOC 2 and ISO. So these are the most common organizational frameworks that companies are pursuing. Both of them are risk-based control frameworks. And so they fundamentally want to see that you're managing risk. However, one of the key points is that it's your company. It's up to your management how you manage that risk as long as you can demonstrate it. So if we think about something like, let's say you didn't have multi-factor authentication enabled, and so then your risk is, hey, there could be unauthorized access to our company and customer data due to some sort of account takeover because we don't have MFA. You rank that risk and you say, hey, we need to implement multi-factor authentication. That's your task, or in ISO terminology, your risk treatment, right? And then you assign that to someone to do. Well, let's step back. Every company has constraints on resources. They have competing priorities. You can't just go spend all the money and do all the information security things because you don't have unlimited budget and time and folks to do it. So you have to make decisions about when you're going to do that. And that's really up to you. And that's actually one of the purposes of the risk assessment, is to show that a person with the reasonable level of authority authorized and made this decision about when we're going to implement MFA. So you might say, well, the way we're going to do MFA, it's going to cost X dollars and it's going to take us 6 months. And as long as you've shown that a person with reasonable authority, typically like a senior executive, because ultimately it's management's responsibility to manage risk at a company. And they've said, hey, we accept that. That makes sense. It's going to be due, Q4 this year. We want to get that done. That should be completely fine. It's really not the auditor's job to dictate to you, what you need to do and when. They just want to see that you have figured that out. Now, one interesting thing. Again, one of the things the risk assessment does is it shows that a person with the right level of authority has made this decision, right? So if you had some just developer, let's say, and they're like, hey, I think we should really do this XYZ, that's one of the reasons you put this on this risk assessment, so that management can review it and approve those decisions going forward.
Yeah, super interesting. I remember early days talking with customers of kind of different roles and responsibilities within orgs, and it was, I suppose, maybe pleasantly surprising to hear how many of them were looking forward to doing this exercise.
Totally.
Just something that they hadn't explicitly done before, something that was kind of perceived to be kind of broadly valuable to the business and not so much scary. I think they appreciated our kind of North Star kind of like direction pointing for them in terms of getting started on this. But yeah, that answer makes a ton of sense. I think one thing that you mentioned, oh, sorry, you want to ask me?
Well, I was gonna say there's a flip side I just want to call out real quick. And it's risk assessment as your sort of insurance policy for not doing things, meaning one of the things you can do is you can accept risk. And you can say, hey, we want to do MFA, but it's actually more important that we get this new, version of our software out and deployed into the world, because from an overall business perspective, like that is the more important thing. So we're actually just going to not do this for, a couple more quarters or something like that. And again, the risk assessment helps you to show that that decision was thoughtfully made by management. So go ahead.
No, I love it. I love it. You mentioned something earlier about kind of like the relationship between kind of these third-party audits and the risk assessment. I'm curious, in simple terms, how do you define the relationship between controls and risks? Yeah. And I asked that in the context of a lot of folks that are going through SOC 2 or ISO for the first time. You're going to log in something like Vanta, or you're going to have conversations with an auditor, and they're going to be using this kind of verbiage of controls from the very first call. So 6th grade kind of language here, like what's the relationship between controls and risk?
Yep. So the sort of the formal theory here is that you assess risk, and then based on that, you select controls or implement controls. And that's great. But then you say, well, wait, ISO, for example, already has the Annex A controls. How does it already have the controls if I'm picking those based on risk? And so, it is the case where, yes, you're choosing controls based on risk, but there's just very common risks across any technology enterprise. And so, the risk assessment will help to show that, yes, these are relevant for you. But I can tell you, encrypting traffic in transit is pretty much universal, right? Like the risk of unauthorized disclosure of data without encryption in transit affects almost everyone. And so, yes, you're picking controls based on risk, but one thing you can do if you're looking for a place to get started is look at something like a fairly standard control list like the Annex A. And there's other ones out there. You can, if you're using a company like a vendor like Vanta, we have control lists for SOC 2, or your auditor has, some standard controls, whatever. And you can look at the control and say, okay, am I doing that control? Mm-hmm. Background checks, right? And then you can say, okay, I'm not doing that control. Well, like what might be the bad thing that would happen because I'm not doing that? And you can kind of, work backwards from the control to figure out your risk. If you're not doing background checks, you have a higher risk that you're going to, hire an unethical person or, someone that misrepresented their qualifications, something like that, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's how I think about it. It's like, yes, formally you're doing risk first, but if you have a set of controls, definitely leverage that to help understand what your risk might be.
Cool. I love it. Last question for me. You've conducted dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands probably, of like risk assessment with clients, millions, maybe not millions, over the years. How does Vanta's approach to helping companies navigate this exercise differ from the approach that you took kind of as a consultant?
Yeah. I mean, actually, Vanta's approach, we would have happily used, Vanta's tooling and approach. I think it's a very sort of classic way to approach risk assessment. One tip I would give folks, like having done this as a consultant, is, you think about, well, how does this third party come in and assess my risk? Like they don't know anything about my organization. And what they do is they go in and they determine sort of some of the key people in the organization. and they talk to them about what they are concerned about, and then they listen and they write that down. And so you can use that same method for yourself, which is just use this as an opportunity, talk to your key folks and ask them, hey, what's your area of responsibility? What softwares, do you work with? What keeps you up at night? What could go bad? What are we not doing right? And this is why a lot of folks are excited to do a risk assessment, is because it's like finally the opportunity to say, hey, I'm a developer here. This thing's been freaking me out forever. And like now I have an opportunity to communicate that. And then maybe management will do something about it. Or maybe management will say, you know what, that's actually not as big of a deal as you might think it is. But like, thank you for communicating it. But all that is to say, just talk to your people, because like I said, you're doing this in your mind anyway, and so are the folks on your team. They're thinking about the things that you should do, and then use that and just document what you already know you should have done from this informal risk assessment that you've been doing in your head. And oh, by the way, don't just talk to your senior managers. Go a level below, because senior managers are a lot of times it's a little, they're politicians as well. But talk to your developers, the people in the weeds, and say, hey, what are we doing wrong? What could we be doing better? And just listen to what they say. And I think you'll find, that you'll get a lot of great information doing that.
Yeah, I love it. I appreciate your perspective on the fact that, like, one of my broad takeaways here is that many companies are kind of informally conducting risk assessments in real time every single day, right, as they're making business decisions. And so I think, with that context, it's important to just acknowledge that what you are asked to do in preparation for a third-party audit doesn't need to be scary or foreign. It's actually an exercise that is probably already ingrained into kind of your company's processes. This is just giving you the opportunity to kind of consolidate that exercise, document it, maybe formalize it, going back to our favorite scary word earlier. Was that a good read?
100%. Yeah, no, 100%. Totally agree with that.
Awesome. Well, Matt, thanks again so much for your time today. Thanks to folks for listening in. We hope that today's chat helps to demystify the risk assessment process for you. It certainly did for me. You can learn more about risk assessments and other security and compliance topics in the resources section of our website at vanta.com. Matt, everyone listening, see you next time.
Cheers, Eric.